In 1929, a group of determined women in the southeastern part of Nigeria took a stand against the British colonial rule in what became known as the Aba Women's Riot. These women, armed with nothing more than courage and the will to fight for justice, faced down an oppressive system that threatened their way of life. This is the story of how ordinary women changed the course of history. It was the Harmattan season in Aba, and the air was dry and heavy. The people of Igbo land lived in peace, going about their farming, trading, and taking care of their families. For generations, life had followed a rhythm. The women were the heartbeat of the communities, planting crops, raising children, and trading goods in the local markets. They had no formal power, but their influence over their families and the economy was undeniable. But as the years passed, things began to change. The British colonial government had imposed new rules, taxes, and regulations that affected everyone. The men were taxed heavily, but now the rumor was spreading that the colonial authorities wanted to tax the women as well. For the women of Aba and the surrounding towns, this was the last straw. Among these women was Nwanyeruwa, a strong and outspoken trader. She was known in her community for her fiery spirit, always ready to defend what was right. When she heard about the new tax proposal, she was furious. She knew that this tax would not only make life harder for the women, but would also disrespect the roles they played in the society. One morning, as the sun rose over the bustling market square, Nwanyeruwa gathered a group of women. "Enough is enough," she shouted. "We will not be taxed like slaves in our own land. If we do not act now, our children will suffer." The other women nodded in agreement. It was time to take a stand. The news spread like wildfire from village to village. Women from different towns, Opobo, Owerri, Umuahia, came together. They were mothers, daughters, wives, and traders, but most importantly, they were united. The women knew that they had to organize and show the colonial government that they were not to be underestimated. Soon, thousands of women gathered, singing songs of protest in Igbo, dancing and chanting, "We will not pay, we will not pay." Their voices echoed through the air, growing louder with each passing day. They marched to the offices of the British officials, demanding that the proposed tax be scrapped. The British, who had never seen such a demonstration from women before, were shocked. The women were fearless. They stood tall, unarmed, and determined. Even when the British officers tried to intimidate them, the women refused to back down. They did not come to fight with guns or weapons. Their weapon was their unity. Nwanyeruwa led the charge, speaking on behalf of the women. "We are the backbone of this land," she shouted in front of the British officials. "Without us, there is no food, no trade, no families. And now you wish to take from us what little we have? We say no." For days, the protests continued. The women occupied the market squares, blocking officials from entering their offices. They made it clear that the tax was unfair and that they would not be silenced. As more women joined the protests, the colonial government realized that they had underestimated the power of these women. But the British officers grew frustrated. On one fateful day, they called in the police to disperse the crowds. Shots were fired into the air, but the women did not run. They held their ground, even as the situation turned violent. Tragically, some of the women lost their lives, but their sacrifice did not go in vain. The Aba Women's Riot, also known as the Women's War, shook the British colonial government. The women's resistance was so strong that the colonial government was forced to suspend the new tax policy. The riot showed the British that the Igbo women, and indeed all Nigerian women, were not to be taken lightly. Even after the protests ended, the legacy of the Women's Riot lived on. It inspired future generations to stand up for their rights. The bravery of women like Nwanyeruwa became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the most ordinary people could fight back against oppression. Years later, when people looked back at that moment in history, they remembered the women who, armed with nothing but their voices and their unity, brought the mighty colonial government to its knees. They were not soldiers, but their courage was stronger than any army. The Aba Women's Riot was not just a protest. It was a movement that showed the power of unity and the strength of women. These women, who lived simple lives, changed the course of history by standing together for what they believed in. Their story is a powerful reminder that change begins with ordinary people, and that courage can overcome even the greatest of challenges.